So let's talk about the US Constitution. I mean, think about it. This thing was written over 200 years ago, and yet it's still the basic operating system for one of the most powerful nations on Earth. How does a document from the 18th century even begin to stay relevant in the 21st? Well, we're about to find out, because it turns out this historic document isn't some dusty relic. It's actually a dynamic, living blueprint for government.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? How can a document that was drafted in the age of horse-drawn carriages and quill pens possibly govern in a world of artificial intelligence and, space travel? The answer, as it turns out, lies in its incredible built-in capacity for change. So, here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at why the Constitution was built for change in the first place. Then, we'll break down the four main ways that change actually happens, through formal amendments, court interpretations, new legislation, and finally, through informal practices. Okay, so the first big idea to wrap your head around is this. The framers of the Constitution were brilliant, not just for what they wrote down, but for what they didn't. They didn't try to create a super rigid set of rules for every possible situation. Instead, they built a flexible framework, a starting point that was meant to be adapted.
And this is really the main takeaway. Change isn't some kind of flaw in the constitutional system. It was actually built right in. It's a feature, not a bug. The government we have today is, in many ways, very different from the one in 1800 or 1900, and that evolution is totally by design. So the real question becomes, how does that change happen?
Well, there are basically four main pathways for that evolution. You've got the official, written changes we call amendments. Then you have the massive power of the courts to interpret what it all means. Next up, all the details that get filled in by new laws. And finally, you have the unwritten rules that just develop over time through informal practice. Let's break each one down. All right, let's dive into the first one. And it's the most direct method, the formal amendment process. This is the heavy-duty tool the Constitution provides to literally rewrite itself.
So what is a formal amendment exactly? Well, it's an official, hard-coded change to the actual text of the Constitution. It's not just a suggestion. It's a fundamental shift in the nation's core legal document. Now, they made this process really hard on purpose. It takes a huge amount of consensus across the country, and that tells you they wanted the system to be stable, but not completely set in stone. It's so tough that it's only happened 27 times in over 2 centuries. And the power an amendment has, it's huge. It can do anything from adding brand new rights, like giving women the right to vote, to just tweaking how the government works. It can replace an old provision, or, and get this, it can completely cancel out a previous amendment, which is exactly what happened with Prohibition. It is the ultimate constitutional edit. Okay, so that's changing the actual words on the page. But what about changing what those words mean in the real world? That's where the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, come in. This is all about the power of what we call judicial review, and you can think of it in two ways. On one hand, the court is kind of like a translator. It takes broad principles like due process and applies them to new situations the framers could never have dreamed of. On the other hand, it's the referee. It can look at a law passed by Congress or a state, and if it conflicts with the Constitution, they can blow the whistle and say, nope, that's unconstitutional.
All right, our third engine of change is Congress itself. If you think of the Constitution as the architect's blueprint, then legislation is all the stuff that actually builds the house. Congress is constantly adding the necessary details to the Constitution's broad strokes.
I mean, the Constitution might grant Congress the power to regulate commerce. Super broad, right? But what does that actually look like day to day? Well, it's legislation that creates the specific agencies, the specific rules that turn that simple phrase into the complex economic system we have today. Congress builds the machinery that makes the whole thing run.
Here's a perfect example of turning a big idea into reality. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the laws. Great principle, but it was the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s that actually gave that principle real teeth. Same thing with voting rights. The 15th Amendment says you can't deny the right to vote based on race, but it took the Voting Rights Act to make that a reality for millions. Legislation turns these powerful principles into practice.
And that brings us to our last method of change. This one's a little more subtle, a little harder to pin down, but it is absolutely powerful. I'm talking about the unwritten rules, the traditions, the informal practices that shape how our government works every single day. The idea here is that these practices, they venture into areas not specifically addressed in the Constitution. They fill in the gaps.
Just think about things like the president's cabinet, or even the role of political parties. None of that is spelled out in the Constitution, but you can't imagine the government functioning without them.
A perfect example? Legislative oversight. You won't find that phrase anywhere in the Constitution. But over time, Congress developed this practice of holding hearings and investigating what the executive branch is up to. Why? It started from a practical need. They realized, hey, if we're going to write good laws, we need information. And what started as a practical need grew into a powerful, established tradition.
So let's just do a quick recap of the whole shebang. You've got formal amendments that literally alter the text. You have court interpretations that clarify what that text means. You have legislation that adds all the operational details. And you have informal practices that create new traditions and processes out of thin air. 4 very different engines all working together to keep the Constitution up and running. So in the end, the true genius of the U.S. Constitution isn't just in the words themselves written back in 1787. It's in the fact that they built a system that could be amended, interpreted, detailed, and practiced in new ways to let it adapt. It's not some relic sitting under glass in a museum. It's a living, breathing blueprint for a world that is always, always changing.
So I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Of these 4 engines of change, amendments, court rulings, new laws, and traditions, which one do you think really has the biggest impact on your daily life? Is it a fundamental right from an amendment, a court ruling on privacy, or just a simple law passed by Congress? It's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in.